It's the same dynamics as any local government or state government. It's just all of them in one room. And if you think about it that way, you can begin to say, okay, I can address these issues the same way I would address them in any local, state, regional setting, and not be expecting the UN to be the one that will do it for you. It is our work. We have to make them do it, just as we have to make the politicians and all the people in our government respond to the demands and needs we have. It was a really important way for me to suddenly think of the UN not as this high in the sky place, but as another arena of everyday political organizing. And I think it's still true today for women who work in that arena, or for women who want to bring issues there, that we have to understand this as one more place, one more space where women need to be present, because women need to be present everywhere if we want the world to change. When women organized for the Vienna World Conference and to try to bring human rights language, to try to make human rights language incorporate women. First of all, I hope many of you have been born in a time when you can't imagine that women's rights aren't human rights. But in 1992 and 93, this was definitely something that the human rights community did not see as a priority. When we asked them to take up issues of domestic violence, they said, well, those are crimes and they're too bad, but they're not matters of human rights. At which point we said, and who defines human rights? Whose life? Whose life gets to define what is demeaning, what is violence, what is torture, what is terrorism? How is it not violence when a woman is confined to her home, beaten and raped and can't get out? These are the same things that human rights groups organize for in other arenas and other settings. Why not for women? And it was that realization that Sunila and I and women around the world were coming to in those years, that we couldn't wait for someone else to decide that yes, the things women cared about, the things feminists were organized about were human rights. We had to simply state it. These are human rights issues because these are the ways that women's human dignity and women's everyday life is violated, that women are tortured, women are killed, women die because of these arbitrary detentions, because of these detainments, because of these violations. And believe it or not, once women began to get that idea around the globe through the petition that we circulated in the global campaign, through hearings that women held in many parts of the world, in Africa, the Women in Law and Development Group had hearings with women in all the sub-regions of Africa, where they simply asked women to come and talk about what is it in your daily life that you think violates your human rights. And of course, the first issue was violence against women. The issue of control of your body, of reproductive control, of violence, and of course issues of poverty, issues of lack of food, of lack of security, all of these things that we now understand to be fundamental human rights for women, but these were not on the agenda at the UN. So we determined to put them there, and it will be a longer story to talk all about how we did that, which I hope we can do in the course in the next 2 days, how women around the world together across national boundaries, because nobody could have done this from any of our countries alone. It was only because we worked to make sure this issue came from every region of the world that women in many, many different countries came to that Vienna World Conference saying, these are the issues that women understand violate our lives. And we dramatized that with the tribunal, but again, the tribunal in Vienna was based on hearings women had done in their own countries, hearings women had done at the local level to make this global statement. So once more, I come back to the global and the local. Without the same connection being made locally that we wanted to put on the agenda in Vienna, we couldn't have done it. Without the lobbying women did of their own governments who went to the conference, it couldn't have been done. So it is that intersection of global and local that created the Women's Rights or Human Rights campaign. And in fact, we found that women were able to make this happen much faster than we expected. Now, partly that was the 90s, it was a good decade, but partly it was also when you have the right idea at the right time and women are ready to stand up for it, amazing things can happen. And the next thing we realized is that we had to do follow-up. We had gone to this conference to get this on the agenda. They said yes. They put violence against women in the list of issues, and by the next year, another fine Sri Lankan woman, Radhika Kumaraswamy, was appointed as the first rapporteur on violence against women in the UN system as a result of this work. And all of a sudden, Radhika came to Sunila and me and her friends and said, okay, what am I supposed to do? So we had to keep doing the work. We had to keep going to the Geneva Human Rights Commission and start showing them what it meant to have a gender, I would say feminist, human rights perspective on issues like housing. How was homelessness for women very connected indeed to violence against women, and a very basic problem. These were the kinds of things that we had to do, and they were all based on women's work at the local level to demonstrate these intersections. The process went on to the Beijing World Conference on Women in 1995, and really continued throughout the whole decade of the 90s with amazing progress as women began to enter major institutions to get gender persecution on the agenda of the International Criminal Court, which actually opened the door for the recent acknowledgement and the calling into question of the Vatican for its allowing sexual abuse of children that happened at UNICEF and in the UN Committee on the Child. These are openings that women made by beginning to connect the personal and the political in a public space. These are openings that the human rights community now sees because of a feminist critique of the public sphere, a critique that is based in our feminist understanding that the personal is political, that the private sphere is not really separate from the public, that in fact what happens in the private sphere is governed by the relations that are set in motion in the public, and that women's violations in the public and the private have to be addressed by governments, by international organizations. And in fact, one of the main contributions that I think feminists have made to human rights practice and theory is to put more emphasis on what we call, in human rights terms, non-state actors, which is to understand that it's not only the government that violates human rights. It is non-state actors. It is individuals in families and homes. It is multinational corporations. It is armies, whether those are organized by governments or by paramilitary forces. It is all of these forces that need to be brought into accountability for human rights. And this is the work that women have set in motion through the women's rights or human rights movement. Now, you don't get that far without somebody trying to stop you. So whenever we face today growing resistance to feminism, growing resistance to women's presence on these agendas, I have to remind you that backlash against us is because we made progress. They don't have to do a backlash unless you're getting somewhere. And we were and are getting somewhere. Women have, in many different arenas, I'm describing the UN work that Sunila and I did together with other women, but it's true of women's work in many other arenas. We have broken into the patriarchal inner sanctum. We have opened doors. We have maybe just cracked a window. But they know that things will change if this continues. So when we face religious fundamentalisms, when we face the closing of non-governmental space, the closing of space for activism, when we face attacks on women's defenders, and one of the really most tragic things of the last decade has been the number of women activists who have been violently and physically attacked and killed, many in Latin America, certainly in Asia, and throughout the world, for their work on human rights issues, and particularly as feminist activists. When we face that kind of backlash, when women are sanctioned for saying these things, we know it's because we have touched a nerve. We have touched the nerve of patriarchy. We have begun to blow some pillars of it, at least to make them wobble a little bit. So I think this is the important work that women must do. We don't expect it to all change in a day, but the lives that women lead today can often be very different than they were 40 years ago.